have Nancy coming, and is she the only staff member coming, I think?
Yeah, she's the only one coming besides myself tonight.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the sort of the things we know. A few more nuts and bolts, but I'm also very interested to get the town clerk's opinion on things. We aren't meeting next week. The following week we'll be meeting with hopefully Board of Finance. Is how we'll be talking, and then the week after that, I had been in conversation with Galen and with Katie Stein, and I believe that we'll have Board of Ed. And then the other conversation, sort of on a scheduling basis, I had was I spoke to Dave Anderson, who apologizes. He was going to try and be here this evening as well. But he had a good idea as how do we talk to sort of all the environmental boards? There's a ton of them. Some of them are impacted by the charter greater than others. And he's going to reach out to all the chairmen, ask them to talk to their boards, and we'll have a meeting TBA where we'll invite we'll invite anybody who wants to show up, but we'll invite the chairs. Or they can just give their feedback to Dave, and hopefully we can consolidate that down into one theme. Okay. So, and Lauren, did I miss anything? I think those are all the next steps.
The only other thing is on the 30th, we also have the ad hoc government study committee that was charged right before you guys to kind of do some of the research for you. So I'll touch on their final report that they gave to the Board of Selectmen tonight, but they're going to come and actually give you guys a little bit of a deeper dive, and also an opportunity to ask them some questions on the research that they did.
Great.
Yeah. So our hope is, and probably somewhere in there, following Joan's suggestion, we'll then take a break and then start another couple of week cycle, then take a break and work our way through. So I guess our first order of business is, yet again, I've shown up not opening the agenda, but I think our first order of business is approval of the minutes, then public comment, or is it public comment, then approval of the minutes?
Public comment, then approval of the minutes.
Do we have any members of the public?
Just one, but no one has their hand raised, so.
Well, if you're there and listening and would choose to say something, feel free.
I think I hear the citizen in the background, Lauren.
Okay, that being the case, do we have any comments on the minutes, or can we get a motion in a second?
Make a motion. Do we approve the minutes?
I'll second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Look at us. We're off to a rocket start.
Right.
Excellent. Lauren, do we want to start with Nancy, or would you like to start? How would you prefer?
We'll start with Nancy. She's here. I just moved.
Hello, Nancy.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Good to see you.
You as well. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for your Herculean work on the public hearing we had, not ours, but the one prior. I don't think I've talked to you since then. That between you and Lauren and everyone else, that was an amazing feat. Bringing
town
everybody
meeting.
In, so well done.
Town meeting.
Yep. First one.
Excellent.
Got through it. Yeah.
Can you, I don't know if everyone knows, Nancy, could you maybe just do a minute or so on the job of the town clerk? Just so we understand the scope of your position.
Oh my!
And how we don't function without it.
A minute. Okay. So so the town clerk is keeper of all the town records. We're almost like historians. We have a vault full of all paper documents. Unfortunately, we still have to keep everything by paper format. So we have all the recordings of land records. In the vault, we have meeting books, all kinds of other documents related to town agreements, things like that. We have a whole section that's caged in for vital records that we have to keep, birth, marriage, and deaths. So we are also a registrar of vital records. We also have a list of other items that we handle in our office. We're the keeper of the town seal. We do notaries, dog licensing, and marriage licensing. Like I said, all the vitals, birth records coming in. We also meet with the funeral directors so that they can acquire the necessary permits that they need. We take in the death certificates. We work closely with the Register of Voters. I oversee the elections and would actually certify election totals. And the list goes on.
And if I remember, as was critical during the Hurricane Irene, they also keep the list of town roads, which is a little leather book that tells us, who made a big difference as to which roads we could clear and when and under what conditions.
So we do have something. We do work together with the town engineer on that. I should also say we work with all the town departments very closely for a number of different things, especially the assessor and tax collector. I'd say we work very closely with them. So, and again, lots of other little things that we do. It's not just one thing that we handle in our office. It's many things that we juggle throughout the day.
And so what can the charter do for you? I think it's the question, or of the many ways, probably between you and Lauren, the two of you interact with it as much or more than anyone. Give us sort of the highlights for what you're thinking.
So there's a number of things actually that do affect my department. I have spoken to Lauren about some of them, and she just knows in the past things that have been an issue. I guess the first thing I'll start with is the annual budget.
Hey, Nance.
Yeah.
It might help. Do you want me to share screen on that document that I did with like all of my notes? That way we can kind of go through some of it at the same time.
Oh, all right. I didn't even I wasn't going through that, but we could if you want. You can jump around and do that.
And then that way, if you just tell me like what section you're talking about, I can go to it on the screen and everybody can read it as we go.
Sure. Not necessarily in order, if that's okay, but we'll start with 10.5, the annual budget. So the annual budget, there's a number of things that relate to our department in this section. And one of the things is it refers to the last week of April, the Board of Finance has to hold their hearing. And then it proceeds to go into time periods of when after the public hearing, when everything happens. It's a really tight restraint, and it only allows the referendum to take place within about a week. It sort of runs from one week to the next. So we're really restricted as to what we can do to actually pick a date for the referendum. And it also overlaps with the fact of doing legal notices on a timely basis. That's kind of another issue with this particular section as well as other sections. So, the newspaper could take 9 days in advance for us to get them the information before it's published. And if you had a holiday also in there, now it's even longer. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Number one, the time period of when we can actually hold the referendum. The legal notices involved, and just that it's set at a time period that pushes us so far into May. If it were turned down and you had to have another referendum, you're really cutting it close to July 1st, which I know then affects the tax collector.
Mm-hmm. So if I could, Nancy, for those of you that may not have seen one consequence to this cycle, is that a lot of our town budget is set in reaction to the state. So things like education cost sharing, the money that we're getting back from the state. And we've had it happen, I remember vividly, at least once, but I know it's been more than once, where if the state's proposals will have a big impact in town, this deadline means that we're sending a budget to the voters ahead of when we know our actual costs. And probably as Joan and Noreen remember, there was at least one time where we advanced quite a heavy it had a significant impact. It was in the millions of dollars.
Mhm.
And the only reason we were in that box was because of these time frames.
But also, one of the things that came up at the Board of Finance presentation the other night was that the state's information is getting later and later to the municipalities. So the recommendation is to actually do the budget without the state information. You have some basic assumptions, but to not rely on the state information prior to bringing it to the public, because then you're looking at rolling potentially into June, and that would just be, or at the end of May, and then there's no time frame. Sorry, Nuri.
May I just add also, I think this Board of Finance, at least since Gene Fitzgerald's been head of it, I think they have just disavowed planning for what the state's going to do. What's happened while she's been chairman is also an incredible big hit on how much the state doesn't give us anymore. So what she has told me the last few years is they go forward assuming whatever they get will be extra. But I mean, we're talking, where we used to be talking 1.6 in an education budget. Now we're talking 300,000. So it's just not enough to slow them down anymore. So they don't really have it impact them at all anymore.
Well, and that was actually, that was the year that was the
right,
problem
the year.
that we had.
Yes.
It was pulling it down. But I guess the way I look at it, whether or not we act in reaction to the state, choose to this year or next, whether or not we suddenly find a gold mine, sitting underneath, Clinton, and then, the state has a ton of windfall, whatever it is, our limitation probably shouldn't be the charter, right? We're using an external hard deadline that hurts for the next decade, means that the whatever the circumstances are today hurts the planning of Madison. If we're going forward and we don't care about external factors and it's working out great, then great, they can hold it when they want. But that's at least how I think that the D chart, Nancy, if I understand your comments and this from before, is that you're looking for, maximum or substantial flexibility on this process. Is that right?
Yeah, so to spread this out a little more so that we're not restricted to choosing a date within a 1 week period would be helpful. That's one part of it. The other part of it is noticing that, putting a legal notice in the newspaper to notice anything, again, it takes 9 days. You have to have it in your local paper. I think our deadline is Wednesday morning for the following Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually for the budget printing, it's even more restrictive because the budget printing is so big. We have to have it to them at least in a draft form 2 weeks in advance.
Right.
So the timeline of, what Nancy, piggybacking on Nancy's comments here in 10.5, the timelines in general in 10.5 tend to be very cumbersome for staff to get everything. It's like playing a game of Tetris in November, trying to get every single date to just match up perfectly with our schedule as a town and then the schedule that the charter prescribes. So this is definitely something that you guys want to consider. How do we add flexibility here so that staff every year can say, okay, the charter says something has to be done by a certain date, but not necessarily on a certain date.
So Lauren, let me ask you this though. Would that start with us actually taking a look at the date the Board of Finance does that public hearing? Because it seems like that triggers, we're not going to be able to do anything about the putting in the paper. Believe me, there's been bills to get that stopped, but the lobbying group of the newspapers is so strong. We've made changes. It could be in a weekly paper now, it's up being a daily or whatever. But I think if we start with the Board of Finance public hearing, does that kind of set the date to some extent that doesn't leave us enough time? Should we move that up? And what do you think?
I mean, the Board of Finance public hearing that you see here in 10.5E, that language has to be revised. Preferably it has to be revised because saying, you'll see here, it says during the last week of April, and that's really cumbersome for us because it means that we have to hold a public hearing during that last week of April, which means if the Board of Finance wants to make changes to the budget before they get it to the printer and before it goes to referendum, it's like nearly impossible for us to have the public hearing that last week of April and get all the changes to the newspaper in time to go to printing. Because generally we have to do it then like Tuesday or Wednesday of that week, with the caveat that we send to the paper the draft and say, we're going to email you at like midnight on Thursday with all the changes that may come after the public hearing.
Right.
So changing that, you know, I had suggested language in here in the red line that just says no later than April 30th. That way it just gives us flexibility of knowing that within the month of April, we're going to hold that last public hearing, and perhaps now we can give ourselves another week to really take the information that comes out of the public hearing and decide if changes need to be made to the budget. You know, if more conversation needs to happen about suggested changes at the public hearing.
Though, if I could ask, Noreen, you said something I don't know. Is the paper publication requirement statutorily based? I had only focused on it on the charter. I think you're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
Yes, it is. We've tried for years to get that changed, but it's been modified. It's not as bad as it was, but it is really just being held up by, I mean, newspapers have told us that it's one of the things that keeps their doors open. So, I mean, and you know, some of the bigger cities, that's a major contribution to the newspapers. But we have tried, and I have not seen anybody budge on it yet.
Okay, so one thing, go ahead.
I have a question for Nancy. Then the timing of allowing for absentee ballots, how does that go into the mechanism too? Because maybe we try to, you know, go from the last date that needs to be the date of the referendum and kind of push everything back and request that the Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen kind of scrunch their time during January, February, and March. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly I would hate to start the whole budget process earlier than we do. But if we could move everything back correct, like a couple weeks, that would be wonderful. Now, it's my understanding we can mail the absentee ballots based on when the Board of Selectmen actually calls the meeting or the hearing, and the date. And we would, as long as it's over a 3-week period, that we can do that. And, you know, that's another thing we could talk about too. You know, things are going to be changing we can use the Dropbox now. And I presume that absentee balloting is just going to change in general. We're going to start seeing more of that. So that's going to be a bigger part of these referendums and any election for that matter.
Right.
Would there be, just for the sake of sort of orderliness among all the, because a lot of groups have to come together for the budget, for the standpoint of the charter, is there any reason why we wouldn't just tell the Board of Finance to declare the date? You know, state what the date that they're going to use is, and they'll that way they've kicked off the beginning of the process.
You mean the referendum date?
Right. Well, both the begin. Once you, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm doing it backward. Once you declare the referendum, then we know we go backward. You know, just give it to them to declare the referendum and give them the ability to change it if something happens. But that way, it's clear who calls the ball. Because if we leave, we can't leave it vague. There has to be a setting of the referendum date, and just tell them they're going to set the first referendum. You know, the first meeting of the calendar year.
So the referendum actually has to be set by the Board of Selectmen.
Right.
And the Board of Selectmen has to call the referendum. This it's in the charter here. You'll see it in 10.5G. But the time frame that Nancy is talking about with absentee balloting is what comes into play with the Board of Selectmen setting the referendum date. So if the Board of Selectmen set the referendum date and it's within 3 weeks of their vote, then there's one absentee ballot process. And if the Board of Selectmen set the referendum date more than 3 weeks out from their vote, it's a different absentee ballot process that the state allows us to use. So it comes down to, we can't set the referendum date in like January. We have to set it closer to when we're actually going to hold it, because that dictates the absentee ballot process. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. It's odd, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
And then to add to that, it depends on when the Board of Finance is meeting, where they actually set the totals for the two questions. That then comes to me the next day so that I can order the ballots and get them in timely to start processing absentee ballots. So yeah.
Well,
So
let's, if I could ask a question, you know, in terms of the charter, right now the
Mhm.
charter gives us a time frame.
Mhm.
Right? Any way we look at it. If we were to hypothetically remove that time frame, what bad could happen? Do we need guardrails? Does the charter need to guardrail the time frame? You know, you don't want a too crafty board of anything to suddenly declare the time too early or too late. You know, is there a logical guardrail on the process that we should consider?
I personally think that if we were having the Board of Finance meet like a week or two, maybe earlier, and then that pushes everything else back, even just a week or two, because right now, literally, it only allows us 1 week time period. I think it runs from like a Thursday to like a Wednesday or something to actually choose a date. But if we moved their meetings back, the hearing, and then the Board of Selectmen calling, if we move it all back a couple weeks, then we actually have a few weeks to say, all right, maybe we want to do it the second week or the third week, or, you know, that's helpful. If we can even push this back, like I know in Guilford, they have it, the referendum is in April, you know, that would even maybe be better.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think this ties back to what Noreen was saying, though. Should we start with the Board of Finance dates and go, and then go from there? I think that's what you were just saying, Nancy, too. If we push that up by 2 weeks, that would make the process a little bit easier.
Well, then you're giving yourself all of May to, you know, to be able to pick a day in May. If you wanted to push it back even further, you could push it back so that you're actually having your referendum in April. Then if anything failed, then you still have May and June, right? Because and I have somewhere here. I think it was in 2009, maybe we had it 3 times, and one of them was in July, and you couldn't set the mill rate or anything, so it can happen.
So I have another question, though. So say we were able to push that back, the Board of Finance date, and then to Joe's point, though, I think that's such a great idea that you also just go ahead and pick that date. And I think, Lauren, it's interesting that you say that the absentee ballot, there's 2 different processes that can occur based on the time. But if we did those 2 things, would that give you that maximum flexibility in between?
Yeah, I'll answer that.
Thanks,
as long as the question is called over a 3-week period, we can actually mail the ballots out to people if we get an application. However, in addition to that, the Board of Finance has to have their hearing that much earlier as well, because if it cuts into that 3-week period, I can't do anything until that's been set, and I actually can order a ballot and get it in. So the time period from the Board of Selectmen calling it to the Board of Finance hearing still needs to be within, like, I think it's within a week of each, so that's fine. But the further out they push it beyond that 3-week period gives me the time to actually get them in and mail them back and forth.
So let me ask you a question. Why doesn't the charter say not no later than, but no earlier than? Why doesn't the charter say that you will hold a public hearing no earlier than March 31st? So and have no date on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, you guys can do that. I mean, this no later than April 30th, that's my note to you. What currently is in there is during the last week of April, and that's what makes this public hearing super cumbersome for us. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely like maybe we can ask Nancy, like in a perfect world, what would the language be that would give the most flexibility, but also give some type of parameter for the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance in their deliberations.
I think you also have to look at, you want to get a budget. You don't want to let it drag out because you don't want to be holding the budget referendum in June. So I think that's where the no later then, because then that allows, if it does go down, the capability to do a second time and even a third time, which we've done before. But yeah, I think I think one of the things is looking at, and maybe we talked to the Board of Finance about this, how do we condense this budget process that appears to start like in August and end in May? So that there's, if you think about it, the CIP starts doing reviews of capital and people start doing this, department heads, and it's like, it seems to be, there's no organization in the world that I know of that has that length of time to create a single year budget.
So
besides
the government.
Yeah. So if we could, Nancy, to the question of what language you think would provide kind of the maximum flexibility, what do you think?
I think that what Lauren said, saying in there not later than, would be a great change.
And if we made that not later than even later, because Joan's point's a good one. You don't want them to start too late, but April, and frankly, in some respects, that's a political decision. I just don't know necessarily why it's charterized. If that were later than, May 15th,
well, actually, no, I would argue that it should be earlier.
I'm actually arguing that it shouldn't be there at all, that maybe the charter should be silent. And if the boards mess it up, then they all get voted out. I'm not so sure what function the charter has here. But I guess, Nancy, that's kind of my question back to you.
And I think it has to have something specific in there. It just needs to give us a little more time in between. So if we're talking about, that we can mail the ballots, we want to have some time for the public. So if, say for instance, we had a date, well, this year it's May 18th, and they meet the last week of April, but it takes me a few days to get in a ballot. Now you're cutting it down to the mailing back and forth. It's only could be a 2.5 week period. So
maybe we say that the Board of Selectmen needs to pick the date of the budget, and then the Board of Finance holds its final public hearing no less than 21 days, 30 days prior to. And that way there, you've got that, the 2 to 3 weeks.
If you push this back, look, in a regular November election, we have a full month to mail them back and forth. And that really gives people time. And then we get rid of what we've been doing under the 3 week period is only able to, where a person can be designated. We can only hand it to the person, or they could designate somebody to get the ballot for them. So we're trying to avoid that because that really is restrictive for people that might be out of town.
Right.
And beyond this, Nancy, I know you've got several issues, and I'm watching the clock. What else would you like to talk with us about? This is clearly important.
Okay, so there was that. Under the section for oaths, which is 11.3, my office really puts in a lot of time with boards and commissions taking their oath. If it could, instead of every time they're reappointed taking their oath, if there was some language in there that once they've taken their oath, if they have consecutive terms, that it's just extended. If there's a break in their term, then they would need to take another oath. That would be an enormous amount of time saved. And again, there's a number of people that when their term is reappointed, they don't contact us to take their oath. And then we're chasing them all the time for it. So that was kind of a big one.
Yeah, I mean, Nancy's actually come to meetings to do the oaths. I remember one commission in particular that I was a liaison to. She said, when's the next meeting? And I told her, she showed up and swore everyone in because no one had gone to see her.
Yeah.
So
that's a big one. And they
two
were
quick-
they've all been on it for years.
So I have just two quick questions on that.
Mhm.
One is, and again, my ignorance in the area, I didn't know if that is if the beyond the original oath, if this re-oathing is not statutory, but just a function of charter. And the second thing is it clear that so I know that periodically I've seen attorneys do the oath. Does it have to be the town clerk? And
No.
can we deputize committee chairman to do it? You know, if we found that there's another way to do it. I mean, do you have a sense of the latitude that we have?
Yeah, no, you have to be able to take an oath. So an attorney can take an oath, a justice of the peace, but yeah, you know, but
that may be a good way to get all the justices together and say, help us do this. And I don't know.
Yeah, aren't there like 8 of them? I think it's a big number, isn't it? The justice of the peace?
6. There's 6 from, well, there's 6 from each party. So
so we've got
so
12
18.
people running around that could do some 18. So
18.
Yeah. So is the and you think the re-oathing is not statutory but just chartery?
I think it is specific to this. The only issue with that is that my office has the sheets that everyone would actually sign. And that's why my office has been the one tracking everybody down. And on occasion, when we do have an attorney do it, they'll pick the form up from us to bring to the meeting.
Mhm.
So that's why I said, if we could change the language, you know, if they're doing a consecutive term, their oath would still be valid. You know, that would eliminate a lot.
Or maybe just it's to see if only elected have to do it versus appointed, because the elected officials are a lot less than all of the appointed committees and commissions.
Well,
Yeah.
if you're already served, if we don't have to re-oath them, I think it's
Yeah.
unless someone has suddenly developed subversive ideas for the town of Madison, my suspicion is it might be all
Right.
right.
Okay.
But
You know,
also
just-
maybe looking at that too, for just elected.
That's true.
So just a
what else do you
suggestion
think,
on
Nancy?
that.
Yeah.
The other thing, and that kind of leads me to, I had heard, I think it was your last meeting where you were discussing the board of being sworn in the week after the election. So
Yeah.
just to kind of add to that, and I agree, I think the following week is really quick. I did ask the Secretary of State, and they came back with, because I asked them just in general, like what is it that what towns are doing, and they just came back and said everybody's all over the place. So
I think our discussion last time was really focused mostly on the first selectman.
Okay.
Who, you know, if the first selectman had another job, you need to then quit.
So just to let you know on that, and the statute reads that it's any elected official has to take oath by January 11th or so, somewhere around that area. So it's 70 days. And a lot of towns do it, it's the second Tuesday after the election in November.
Right.
Or in January. So just to kind of throw that out there a little bit.
So we've got, if we wanted to make a different decision for the first selectman versus the other selectman, we could allow some extra time.
It's 70 days.
Excellent.
So a thought on that. And in general, just to say too, I know there's a lot of cleanup with numbering in the charter, which I'm sure you guys have all that with, but I can talk to Lauren specifically just to make sure some things are cleaned up. There's a number of places that refer to a specific number and it doesn't exist. So,
Right. Yep.
So there was that.
So I have a question to ask. If we just hold the first selectman off and there's a potential change, then there might be somebody that wasn't elected sitting. There may be an open seat, is my point. So if we look at the last election, say Peggy didn't take office until, you know, 2 or 3 weeks or December or something like that, but the rest of the board did. Bruce Wilson wasn't elected, so then you've got not 5 people on the Board of Selectmen. So just a thought there. I'm throwing that out.
Mhm.
But I thought what we were talking about is everything would be pushed back. I mean, all the commission boards, not elected, commission boards, the changeover is in January. And I think we were talking about maybe our elected officials have to almost do the same thing. So the 5 members of the board that are elected as of election day, before pre-election day, would stay on until the transition. And whatever that time would be, you said December or January. I think that's what we're trying. I think really that's something we've got to look at for our elected officials. I think a lot of towns do it. We're kind of behind the times with doing it.
Yeah, I think most of them are either the second Tuesday after the election or the first, I think it's the first Monday actually in January.
Yeah, I mean, we could just have everything take over the first Monday in December, you know, and that alone would fix the problem that we're addressing, right? The problem we have is the full-time job, of which there's one, you know, creates a mess. And if we just stretched it out a couple of weeks, I don't know that we'd be doing the other side of things.
You know, Joe,
the concern about that though. Okay, sorry, Noreen.
Yeah, go ahead, Noreen, then Joan.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Joan.
Oh, you're muted, Joan.
Okay.
The concern
Joan,
I've
then
got
Noreen.
about that is that the appointments that happen in January can sometimes change because under state statute, the appointed and boards can be a majority of the new majority party. So when there is a shift from one party to another in the election, that could throw a wrench in the next 2 years of the appointments. That's my concern there.
Yeah.
Well,
So
when are the
ahead,
appointments made? And are the appointments made in January? Reappointments made in January?
Yeah, that's what they've done.
So wouldn't you have a whole new board sitting? But I just think for us to pick a date, why don't we look what other towns are doing, what's working for them?
Yeah, I think if I recall from Fillmore's point, and Nancy mentioned it too, I think towns are a little everywhere. So we know that where we're placing it at the moment is probably too tight, and we should just find a reasonable point that moves out.
Okay.
Dropped off.
A couple other things. When I was getting on earlier, there was conversation about number of questions. Just so that you know, I've already approached the Register of Voters to check on the cards that they have, the tabulator cards. Right now, they only take up to 3 questions, so they're going to be looking into getting new cards. And my understanding is that you can have up to 12 questions on a card as max. So it would also depend on when you're going to do the charter questions. If this is in November on a state ballot, are they going to have any questions as well? So just to kind of keep that in mind, and we can, you know, stay in contact about that to make sure the registers are prepared with whatever they need. And I think the only other thing I really had to, and Joe, I had a conversation with you about this at one point, was to put something in about appointing moderators for the town meetings so that we're not scrambling trying to find someone. And so I've heard of other towns appointing a moderator from each party, and then they actually deputize a deputy just in case if there's a pool of like 4 people to pull from. That actually leads me to another point too. And maybe we don't want that necessarily in the charter. Maybe that could be in an ordinance. You've also discussed putting and moving over all the commissions over to the ordinance instead of having them in a charter. Personally, I think that makes sense. You know, I know there's a lot of sections here that overlap that you really have to look at and not miss. But I think that, that's not a bad suggestion to put that to ordinance.
Yeah, I was mistaken when I talked about Guilford's charter and I initially opened it up and there was 200 and something pages. The charter itself is like 10. The rest of them are all the ordinances that go along
Right.
with everything else. So that was an interesting read. Well, after I fell asleep a couple of times, but no, it's a nice structure. It's a very succinct, quick read for the actual charter, and then all the ordinances that go on and on and on. So
Right.
Yeah.
So even with our website, the charter is on and it's by itself, but then the charter is also part of the booklet with the ordinances that we use Municode to maintain that.
Mhm.
And when you go on our site, it's actually, they're putting it up. And so anytime there's a change in an ordinance, I would be notifying them, and so that it's and it's more accurate instead of our webmaster trying to manipulate it every time there's a change.
Excellent.
One of the things that I like the idea of looking at the ordinances over, really to tie up the charter any more than we have to is a shame. But I noticed, I did some investigation on what's happened to our ethics commission and why we don't have one. And most towns do it by ordinance. So I know there's a mention that we can do it in this charter. I know it's been brought up by the Board of Selectmen, but really, if you look at the majority of towns, like 74 towns that have a commission, and most of them all have a policy, which we have. But it's all, I would say 75% have been done by ordinance. And I think that goes right along with a lot of the commissions.
So I think probably the one exception are some of the statutory commissions. So
Right.
maybe we should want to maybe we don't need them in charter. Maybe just a sentence saying we'll enact all commissions as required by statute. Might be the simplest and most direct way to do it. I don't think the town's going to wipe out the zoners, but maybe we need to actually consider that we should have a separate discussion for sort of the big statutory reports.
Mm.
Any other questions for Nancy? And thank you, Nancy, for bringing up the slate of moderators idea, which I think as a recent moderator to a town hall, you see what happens when Ron Clark's not available. There's a little bit of a scramble. So I think working that out ahead of time, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, that was
thank you
all
very
I
much,
had.
Nancy. I'm sure we'll be tapping on you again as we start considering actual things to do. Have you take a look at them and say, "Oh my God, don't do that." Would be, I think, a very useful service to your town.
Well, I appreciate everything that you're doing. I think it's an important thing. And as you said, to do a number of questions, I think is also the right way, so that again, we can at least get it cleaned up, hopefully, and not refer to sections that are not there. So. So thank you. I appreciate all your work.
Right. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Lauren, how would you like to then proceed for the next phase? Do you want to step through parts of the charter? I mean, you've got a lot of corrections, so we're going to need a homework assignment where it's not going to be efficient for you to walk us through all of them, but do you want to walk through some near and dear your heart, or how would you like to proceed in this next part?
So, I mean, luckily Nancy stepped on one of the biggest issues that I have with the charter is how prescribed it is for the budget process. So I think just in general, my recommendation or guidance for you guys would be to really consider what is currently in the charter that needs to stay and what exactly you think should be very strict in the charter. So the charter is supposed to supplement state statutes for us. It's supposed to clarify. The state says that every municipality has the authority to do X, Y, Z, and the charter says, and this is how you do it, and these are the limits or the quorum, et cetera, that you can implement those state statutes under. So I think as a committee, you guys really need to consider what in the charter can be a guideline that has a clear beginning and an end, and what in the charter actually has to be a very specific amount or date. And that's kind of what I went through and sent you guys this redlined document on, just all of our notes over the years. I've been with the town now for 6 years. So this is starting here 6 years ago. I had no municipal experience at all. So within a month of me starting, was told, why don't you go take minutes one time for the 2015 Charter Committee? And because like they're in a pinch and they just need somebody to take minutes, just, go 7 o'clock in the morning. Sure, why not? And at that time I lived an hour and a half away from the building. So yeah, that was awesome.
Sucked you in.
Yeah. So, at that point in time, I had no idea what the charter document allowed or didn't allow the town to do. So that was a huge learning experience for me. But then also as my role within the town has changed, over 6 years, I have an entirely different type of role with the town now than I did 6 years ago. So really being one of the people that's always in the charter, I open the charter probably 2 or 3 times a week in order to do my job. So these notes are kind of just a guideline for you guys of here are all the ways that the charter has impeded me doing my job efficiently, or here are the ways that I feel perhaps that the public hasn't had the right amount of representation based on what's in the charter. Definitely one of the things you guys should definitely consider are all these thresholds. So it's the threshold number for quorum. We talked about this at one of your last meetings, and if you went to the town meeting last month and saw what that was like, then that's such a big deal. Getting 75 people to come to a town meeting almost never happens. So it's something that has to be considered. Do we lower the threshold so that items have to go to a vote? Because right now the charter says, and the state allows, that if we don't hit that quorum, the item automatically passes. So do you lower the threshold amount so that it has to go to a vote with people in attendance, or do you not lower that amount? And that's something that I think talking to the elected boards is really going to help you, talking to the Board of Finance, because most of the items that we'll take to a town meeting are financial. So talking to them and asking, their guidance on how they think, pretty much how they think taxpayers' money should be spent with or without taxpayers voting on it. That's a big deal. And also I think the dollar amount thresholds, you have to consider that this charter is from 2006. So by the time you guys get this approved through the town, this charter is going to be almost 20 years old. And that means that these dollar thresholds, that the first selectman can only accept donations up to $2,000. Well, that's kind of an arbitrary amount, So that means that if somebody wants to gift us a bench that costs $2,001, it now has to go to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance before we can actually say, yeah, sure, give us the bench. So that's, something to consider is these dollar amount thresholds. Should they be increased? And same thing with disposing of something. So if I have a desk that's broken, but it cost $2,500 to purchase it 5 years ago, I have to take that to the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance in order to get rid of a desk that's broken. So these are things that, they just kind of impede the day-to-day operations, the smooth, like what we like to call the efficient running of government. So, I know that this document is a lot. There's a lot of notes. There's a lot of red. There's probably more red typing now than there is, black typing. So I know that it's a lot to go through. So I'm happy to answer questions at any meeting, or if you guys want to email me, if you're, like Joe said, if you're taking this and doing some homework on it and you have some questions as to why I've given you a note, I'm happy to either answer it or get you in touch with the staff member that's told me that item has been,
I have so since you and I swap notes, I have a proposal on this part that I'm wondering if, since we're not meeting next week, woohoo, all the free time, but I'm wondering if we couldn't just put as a standing item for the next couple of meetings, just the first 15 minutes, take the next section on changes and then discuss with Lauren, the changes in that section, and then just move on to the next. And then we're doing it kind of piecemeal. I think it's better for all of our collective attention spans. And B, I think that because we're doing other things, it may be a way for us to start to form a view of the charter as a whole. So and as I kind of went through and did the quick flip through, and most of the individual sections looked like 15 minutes. You know what I mean? That's a little, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe, one of them will be, 45 minutes of heartrending conversation here on part of the Charter Commission. But I'm wondering if we just did that discussion, because it looks to me like we could get through a lot of, either vet significantly a lot of your issues within a couple of weeks. What do you guys think?
I think it's a great idea. Definitely doable.
Yeah, I think if you're talking articles or sections.
I was talking articles.
Okay, I think articles, 15 minutes per article is a little tough because there are articles that are.
Yeah, you're right. We could do the first 3 in one 15-minute.
Right.
and then Article 4, we should break into 3 or 4.
Right. So I think you just say, okay, what are we going to try to, let's agree the next meeting, let's hit these. And then everybody take a review.
Yeah, and then you can say that the articles that you really need to have a more in-depth conversation, we'll push those to the end.
Actually, well, Lauren, I'm wondering, since the ones that are the biggest, the ones that you'd like to talk about the most, would you, so if we agree that let's look through, I don't have your document open directly in front of me. I'm trying to recall, I think the amount of red in the first 3 was incredibly small. Am I remembering it correctly?
No. So the preamble had a bit.
Yeah.
And the articles in general, and some of the language of cleanup.
Yeah.
So the other thought could be, because there was a lot of work done for just cleanup of language, would be to look at the red line version from 215, skip the new stuff in 215, the big changes, and just go, okay, here are the language changes.
My one concern about that is that I'm afraid that it's easy then to become confused version to version. So since this version, if I understand it, has that as well as the new stuff, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to talk about. Because if we're looking at 1.2 powers and privileges, we could actually do we agree with the crossouts, and this new section, and then just highlight what do we want for later discussion. Because otherwise we're kind of doing it twice. What do you think? I kind of think we linearly talk about this document since it's got them both. And do you think we could reasonably do articles 1, 2, and 3 by next time? And then Article 4 we should probably break up into a couple of meetings.
Well, I think you may just talking about nomenclature and usage.
Yeah.
There was a big discussion. I mean, I think if we're just, I don't know. I think if you look at each paragraph and you really want to get into the meat, you need to, because there may be stuff that maybe hasn't been picked up in this version either. So I don't know. Lauren,
this won't be the. Go ahead, John.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering.
This should be both. This should be, the kind of more cleanup items in addition to, the highlights, which are the items that you guys actually want to consider changing in a more substantive way.
So why don't I suggest this? Why don't we assume that we'll be talking about Article 1 and 2, but Lauren and I will get together in the next couple of days and chit chat and lay out a little homework schedule on it. Roughly, and then we'll see how the conversation goes. If a section goes long, then fine, we'll continue the conversation in that 15-minute block at the beginning the next week. It's not to cut off conversation, but to keep it going. Does that sound legit?
Because where you get a little crazy is during the conversation about petitioned town meetings, because it is very technical.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Those are the real. You kind of go around into it. So I think that's good though. Let's go for that.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the way we should be able to go through this, and we should then not have solved the world, but at least from this standpoint, we should end with a document that has a lot of things saying, yeah, we agree with that, and here's a flag for further discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And can we say that we're going to do it at the end of the meeting so that the people coming to our meetings, we hear them first and we'll have fresh in the mind, or do we want to have them come later in the meeting?
I would almost prefer to do it at the beginning, because things that are done at the end of the meeting tend to, like, this is a little attention grabbing. So maybe what we could do is still notice public comment, but just make it clear that there'll be a section, and at 7:20, we'll begin, or we could even start public comment at 7:15. Like, just be disciplined. Like, we're starting our meeting, approval of minutes. This is our first 15 minutes of discussion. Public comment 1, public comment 2, and then the public gets to hear us talk about this, to the extent we're talking about it.
Okay.
And actually, I sort of like that. It's that way we know that every meeting we stand up and we've done a little bit on the wording. And I think that feels kind of good to me. And by the way, if you determine that this actually doesn't do what we want, let me know and we'll find the next thing. But this was sort of Lauren and I had swapped some notes, and then this is my thought as one way to approach it. Lauren, does that sound all right to you?
That sounds great.
All right. So at the very least, we'll be noticing this for discussion for the first 15 minutes. And Lauren, why don't you and I make sure we hop on the phone together tomorrow or so, and we'll try and go through a rough syllabus for the Charter Review Commission.
Perfect.
Excellent. What else do we have for today?
So the other part of my item was just talking quickly about that government study committee. So the government study committee was charged last winter. They started meeting right before COVID and then transitioned all their meetings to remote meetings. So they weren't able to meet with a lot of other town CEOs in person, but they did hold a bunch of phone calls. They broke up into subgroups, and each subgroup reviewed a certain form of government. And then depending on which form of government the subgroup, the subcommittee was researching, one or both of them also called and had a conference call with the CEO that matched that form of government. So they looked into whether or not Madison should switch its form of government altogether. So should we stay a town meeting form of government, or should we go to an RTM, or should we go to a council mayor, council manager form of government? And then they also did a public information survey and asked the residents, we did it based on a scale of statements that were either agree or disagree. So it was a sliding scale. And basically every response was either that people felt that the town meeting form of government was effective for Madison, or that they had neither agree or disagree. So they were kind of neutral on it. No one, I want to say it was 12% of the 130 responses said that they felt that the selectmen or the town meeting form of government was ineffective for the town. So I think that information is important for you guys, because it kind of steers you away from going back and unless of course you'd like to go back and re-look at other forms of government and do more public outreach, which is totally within your purview to do. But it did kind of give you guys a little bit of research into the town's feeling as to whether or not the selectman, town manager for our town meeting form of government, it has been ineffective in town. Overall, the committee felt that a lot of the public comment steered towards a town manager, but the committee was also on their own personal level, individually, they were conflicted internally as to whether or not they felt that there was enough evidence to support that we should absolutely go to a town manager. So they didn't really present that a town manager wasn't wanted, but they also didn't really have enough to say that it's definitely the flavor of the town. So I don't really know, unfortunately it wasn't super conclusive for you guys, but I do think it illustrates that you should look into it. That should be something that you consider when we get to that first selectman section of the charter and who the CEO of the town is, and whether, when we talked about at your public hearing with Gus Horvath, that there is that weird sentence in there that says that you guys can have a CAO, the Chief Administrative Officer, but then it references guidelines in section 7.3, and 7.3 doesn't exist. So you may decide that you want to just implement what those guidelines are for the CAO, or you may decide that you want to take that sentence out and just have it stay for selectman as the CEO of the town, period. But that's definitely something that you have to look into, in my opinion anyways. I think It's been a topic in town hall for 6 years among staff. It's been a topic in town hall for 6 years among the elected boards and also among the public.
Can you get us the language that was 7.3 that Gus was referencing? Or is that in one of the older charters, or did it just?
My understanding is that that reference is in the Ark of the Covenant somewhere buried in a government warehouse.
Yeah,
I believe that's where we, so Bob, you have DC connections, you know, you'll have to go and locate that for us, but I'm not aware that 7.3 ever, you know, was created. Is that, that's what I've been told over the years.
I believe 7.3 was in a draft of the 2006 charter before it was sent to the public to vote on. Gus seems to think that it existed in the charter prior to 2006, but I couldn't find, I can't find it. So I don't know. And this, you know, knowing that 2006 is when we kind of started putting things on the website and keeping a better track of things electronically in the computer, which means that a charter prior to that would have been 5 to 10 years before that. And we didn't even have a town website really then. So it's not something that would be readily available. And it's not something that we've been able to pinpoint ever really existed in a final version of a charter. Not saying it didn't, just that I haven't been able to dig it up.
Indiana Rhines, we appreciate your work.
And anyone who knows me knows that I love to investigate things. So the fact that I can't find it is probably more troublesome to me than anyone else.
So I do think so just two quick things. One is, I mean, one of the questions is to what extent does the charter tell a first selectman how they're going to staff and run the organization, right? That is one of the, we get Titan's town manager question, but they're having questions in the past like, oh, wait, what can and can't you do with your own staff members? And I'm personally, I will talk about this later. I personally don't know that that's a constraint you want to put on the official one way or the other. The other thing is I did want to, and I'd mentioned this to Lauren, but I think also to Noreen, that I had an interesting conversation with one of my colleagues, Professor Peter Kotchenberger. He does insurance law. He's a long time, and I can't remember what they're called in Manchester, as a representative or he's on the council. And Manchester's had a town manager for decades. So I did ask if he and his mayor might come in, because some of the questions we asked, like, you know, what happens? How did the certification? How do they pick them? What if it doesn't go well? They've got decades of experience, and I think it was Noreen suggested some other people. I would like to talk to groups, not that made the decision to do it, but that have been living with it. And I think that would be extremely, for me, it'd be very informative, because I really don't know that much about it. I was surprised in a casual conversation. We were doing something else, and I mentioned this board. He had answers to about 5 things we asked, you know, so I'd like to gather some people like that. It doesn't speak, you know, for or against it, but I think it at least would be, you know, helpful to us, and probably any of the members of the public that are listening.
No, Joe, and I think too, looking at this report from the government group, one of the towns, actually the only town I think that actually had a regular town manager is North Branford, but they interviewed the town manager. And I've spoken to people in North Branford who are not, you know, not happy, and they've had a town manager for a long time. So we need to really talk to that. The reason I brought Stratford up is they were town manager, and I don't remember when that was my hometown. That's why I'm talking about Stratford. But I grew up with a town manager form of government. It flipped at some point, and they have a mayor now. But I think we should be talking to CEOs, because I mean, they talked to Clinton, who had, you know, a town manager for all of 9 months. We really need to get more information than what we really got from some of the towns in this report.
Well, the charter revision document that was sent along with that shows the listing of town meeting versus council manager versus mayor versus other. God, whatever other is. Is that representative town council? Is that what the RTM?
RTM maybe.
And there's 2 types of that. There's 2 different types of that. Yep.
So
I meant the interviews, the people they interviewed.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we'll have a chance to ask that group.
Yeah, I think
about it. Which will
Joe, when you
help
brought that up to me, I'm sorry. I was talking Mansfield. Did you see my comment about Yukon?
Yeah.
Did you wonder what I was talking about?
No. I do exactly what you meant.
Okay.
That
I'm sorry.
it's an unusual town given the size of the given the size of the university. But I do think the idea of talking to this government studies committee and then talking to some towns ourselves, I think would be a nice way to kind of, for me, it would really, help this conversation. Lauren's quite right. It's been around forever. It would help.
And I think, I emailed Joe this week as well, because when the government study committee had first convened and looked into towns that had abandoned the town manager form of government, we were also given New London and Hartford as towns that had gone from a town manager and then back to an elected CEO. But both of those, and those towns are much bigger than us, but both of those towns still have some type of chief of staff, chief administrative officer. So it's just something to consider is, what support do we want to, who should the CEO be, A, and B, what support should the CEO have in the form of some other type of professional day-to-day position?
Yeah, and I not to sing my favorite song, to what extent does the charter have a say in that second question? This was, this really did come up some years ago, and then there was this sort of almost ecclesiastical reading of the charter as to whether or not it could possibly empower who people in town hall reported to. And it's a conversation I think worth having. But anyway, I don't want to belabor that.
You can make up some T-shirts with that on it, Joe. I'll wear them.
Actually, we need charter review sportswear. We do.
Get some swag. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Lauren, is there anything else on our agenda? We're already I think I committed to 6 o'clock, and I think we break that pretty regularly.
By the way, I wanted to hear Nancy say more about what she does as the keeper of the town seal.
Yes, I think there are robes and a hat involved, if I recall.
Yeah, I get to use it to stamp things and make them pretty.
Oh.
I
have that type of seal. Oh no.
Yeah.
It's not like a town.
It's in the town aquarium.
Yeah. The town animal mascot.
Do we have any members of the public, Lauren?
No, we had one member and he dropped off, so we have no public comment.
I think we're not going to view that as a referendum on our entertainment value. All right. Any other questions or thoughts about what we'll be doing? So we won't see you next week. You'll get a communication for us about how we'll try and break up the sort of the paper review. Lauren, if you'll just remember, we'll literally, notice the public comment, the first public comment after the first textual, we'll call it the text review or something like that. And maybe we should even, for the sake of the public, put a bracket, say approximating 15 minutes.
Yeah.
That way they have an expectation as to when they can speak.
And Lauren, I know you sent out a lot of documents. I only got through the, the previous study one. Did you send out the one with all the red markups?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was earlier?
Yeah.
Way back, yeah.
So there was an initial email that went out last week that had 10 attachments, and then one that went out this week that only had 2.
Okay.
But I did make notes from, things Nancy was saying tonight. If you guys could see the screen as we were going, I was making some notes. So I'll send you out tonight's version of that document.
Perfect. Good. Well, thank you for arranging that. That was great. All right. And we'll also get some emails as to Board of Finance will be our next special guest stars.
Okay. That should be fun.
See all of you in 2 weeks.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Guys.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye now.